Hi. For your convenience, I might be sitting in VC, so I'm there now. If you wanted to do other stuff while, like you mentioned before, then I am there. So, it might be better for you. Got what I mean? Yeah? Yeah. The lag on my system is so unappealing. Oh, I don't like lag. Mm-mm. Nope. The lag. Very poor. Hate the lag. Mm-mm. Not nice. Mm-mm. Lag is... Ugh. She drifted, all shadowy black silk, across the shadows of the dining hall, dropping her winnings into a black satin vanity bag and attended by the priest. Outside the door, beneath the antlers of a royal stag, in an atmosphere of paraffin lamps and varnished pitch pine, she said, "Come up to my sitting room. The prodigal's returned. Sylvia's here." The father said, "I thought I saw her out of the corner of my eye in the bus after dinner. She'll be going back to her husband. It's a poor world." "She's a wicked devil," Mrs. Satterthwaite said. "I've known her myself since she was 9, Father Consett said. "It's little I've seen her hold up the commendation of my flock," he added. "But maybe I'm made unjust by the shock of it." They climbed the stairs slowly. Mrs. Satterthwaite sat herself on the edge of a cane chair. She said, "Well!" She wore a black hat like a cartwheel, and her dresses appeared always to consist of a great many squares of silk that might have been thrown onto her. Since she considered that her complexion, which was matte white and gone slightly violet from 20 years of makeup, which was not made up, as she never was at Lopshide, she wore bits of puce-coloured satin ribbon stuck here and there, partly to counteract the violet of her complexion, partly to show she was not in mourning. She was very tall and extremely emaciated. Her dark eyes, that had beneath them dark brown thumb marks, were very tired, or very indifferent by turns. Father Consett walked backwards and forwards, his hands behind his back, his head bent over the not too well polished floor. There were 2 candles, lit but dim, in imitation pewter Nouvelle Art candlesticks, rather dingy. A sofa of cheap mahogany with red plush cushions and rests. A table covered with a cheap carpet and an American roll-top desk that had thrown into it a great many papers and scrolls or flat. Mrs. Satterthwaite was extremely indifferent to her surroundings, but she insisted on having a piece of furniture of her papers. She liked also to have a profusion of hothouse, not garden flowers, but as there were none of these at Lopshide, she did without them. She insisted also, as a rule, on a comfortable chaise longue, which she rarely, if ever, used. But the German Empire of those days did not contain a comfortable chair, so she did without it, lying down on her bed when she was covered with pictures of animals in dead agonies. caposalesies, giving up the ghosts with gouts of scarlet blood on the snow. Deer dying with their heads back and eyes glazing, gouts of red blood on their necks, foxes dying with scarlet blood on green grass. These pictures were frame to frame, representing sport, the hotel having been a former Grand Ducal hunting box, freshened to suit the taste of the day with a varnished pitch pine, bathrooms, verandas, and excessively modern but noisy lavatory arrangements which have been put in for the delight of possible English guests. Mrs. Satterthwaite sat on the edge of a chair. She had always the air of being just about to go out somewhere, or having just come in and being on the point of going to take her things off. She said, "There's been a telegram waiting for her all the afternoon. I knew she was coming." Father Consett said, "I saw it in the rack myself. I misdoubted it," he added. Oh dear, after we've talked about it, now it's come." Mrs. Satterthwaite said, "I've been a wicked woman myself as these things are measured, but—" Father Consett said, "You have. It's no doubt from you she gets it, for your husband was a good man, but one wicked woman is enough for my contemplation at a time. I'm no Saint Anthony. The young man says he will take her back." "On conditions," Mrs. Satterthwaite said. "He is coming here to have an interview." The priest said, "Heaven knows, Mrs. Satterthwaite, that there are times when the poor priest, the rule of the church as regards marriage, seems bitter hard, and he almost doubts her inscrutable wisdom. He doesn't mind you, but at times I wish that that young man would take what advantage there is that he can of being a Protestant and divorce Sylvia. For I tell you, there are bitter things to see amongst my flock over there." He made a vague gesture towards the infinite. "And bitter things I've seen, for the heart of man is a wicked place, but never bitterer than this young man's lot." "As you say," Mrs. Satterthwaite said, "my husband was a good man. I hated him, but that as much as my fault as his. More, and the only reason I don't wish Christopher to divorce Sylvia is that it would bring disgrace on my husband's name. At the same time, Father," the priest said, "I've heard near enough. There was this to be said for Sylvia," Mrs. Satterthwaite went on. "There are times when a woman hates a man, as Sylvia hates a husband. I tell you, I've walked behind a man's back and nearly screamed because of the desire to put my nails into the veins of his neck. It was a fascination, and it's worse with Sylvia. It's a natural antipathy." "Woman!" Father Consett fulminated. "I've no patience with ye. If the woman at the church directs, or would have children by her husband and live decent, she would have no such feelings. It's unnatural to live, and unnatural practices that cause these complexes. Don't think I'm an ignoramus priest if I am." Mrs. Satterthwaite said, "But Sylvia's had a child." Father Consett swung round like a man that has been shot at. "Whose?" he asked, and he pointed a dirty finger at his interlocutress. "It was that blackguard Drake's, wasn't it? I've long suspected that." "It was probably Drake's," Mrs. Satterthwaite said. "Then," the priest said, "in the face of the pains of the hereafter, how could you let that decent lad, in the hotness of his sin—" "Indeed," Mrs. Satterthwaite said. "I shiver sometimes when I think of it. Don't believe that I had anything to do with trepanning him, but I couldn't hinder it. Sylvia's my daughter, and dog doesn't eat dog." "There are times when it should," Father Consett said contemptuously. "You don't seriously," Mrs. Satterthwaite said, "say that I, a mother, if an indifferent one, with my daughter appearing in trouble, as the kitchen maid say, by a married man, that I should step in and stop a marriage that was a godsend?" "Don't," the priest said, "introduce the sacred name into an affair of Piccadilly bad girls." He stopped. "Heaven help me," he said again. Don't ask me to answer the question of what you should or shouldn't have done. You know I loved your husband like a brother, and you know I've loved you and Sylvia ever since she was tiny. And I thank God that I am not your spiritual adviser, but only your friend in God. But if I had to answer your question, I could answer it only in one way. He broke up to ask, "Where is that woman?" Mrs. Satterthwaite called. "Sylvia! Sylvia, come here!" A door in the shadows opened, and light shone from another room behind a tall figure, leaning one hand on the handle of the door. A very deep voice said, "I can't understand, Mother, why you live in rooms like a sergeant's mess." And Sylvia Tegens wavered into the room. She added, "I suppose it doesn't matter. I'm bored." Father Consett groaned. "Heaven help us, she's like a picture of Our Lady by Fra Angelico." Immensely tall, slight, and slow in her movements, Sylvia Tegens wore her reddish, very fair hair in great bandeaux right down over her ears. Her very oval, regular face had an expression of virginal lack of interest, such as used to be worn by fashionable Paris courtesans a decade before that time. Sylvia Tegens considered that, being privileged to go anywhere, everywhere where one went, and to have all men at her feet, she had no need to change her expression or to infuse into the greater animation that marked the more common beauties of the earlier 20th century. She moved slowly from the door and sat languidly on the sofa against the wall. "There you are, Father," she said. "I'll not ask you to shake hands with me. You probably wouldn't." "As I am a priest," Father Consett answered, "I could not refuse. But I'd rather not." "This," Sylvia repeated, "appears to be a boring place." "You won't say so tomorrow," the priest said. "There's 2 young fellows and a sort of policeman to trepan away from your mother's maid." "That," Sylvia answered, "is meant to be bitter. But it doesn't hurt. I'm done with men." She added suddenly, "Mother, didn't you one day, while you were still young, say that you had done with men? Firmly. And I mean it." Mrs. Satterthwaite said, "I did." "And did you keep to it?" Sylvia asked. Mrs. Satterthwaite said, "I did." "And shall I, do you imagine?" Mrs. Satterthwaite said, "I imagine you will." Sylvia said, "Oh dear." The priest said, "I'd be willing to see your husband's telegram. It makes a difference to see the words on paper." Sylvia rose effortlessly. "I don't see why you shouldn't," she said. "It will give you no pleasure." She drifted towards the door. "If it would give me pleasure," the priest said, "you would not show it to me." "I would not," she said. A silhouette in the doorway, she halted, drooping, and looked over her shoulder. "Both you and Mother," she said, "sit there scheming to make life bearable for the ox. I call my husband the ox. He's repulsive, like a swollen animal. Well, you can't do it." The lighted doorway was vacant. Father Consett sighed. "I told you this was an evil place," he said. "In the deep forests, she'd not have such evil thoughts in another place." Mrs. Satterthwaite said, "I'd rather you didn't say that, Father. Sylvia would have evil thoughts in any place." "Sometimes," the priest said. "At night I think I hear the claws of evil things scratching on the shutters. This was the last place in Europe to be Christianized. Perhaps it wasn't ever in the perhaps it wasn't even Christianized and they were here yet." Mrs. Satterthwaite said, "It's all very well to talk like that in the daytime. It makes the place seem romantic, but it must be no one at night, and things are bad enough as it is." They are, Father Consett said. The devil's at work. Sylvia drifted back into the room with a telegram of several sheets. Father Consett held it close to one of the candles to read, for he was short-sighted. All men are repulsive, Sylvia said. Don't you think so, Mother? Mrs. Satterthwaite said, I do not. Only a heartless woman would say so. Mrs. Vanderdecken, Sylvia went on, says all men are repulsive, and it's women's disgusting task to live beside them. You've been seeing that foul creature, Mrs. Satterthwaite said. She's a Russian agent, and worse. She was at Gozingo all the time we were, Sylvia said. You needn't groan. She won't split on us. She's the soul of honour. It wasn't because of that I groaned, if I did, Mrs. Satterthwaite answered. The priest from over his telegram exclaimed, Mrs. Vanderdecken, forbid. Sylvia's face, as she sat on the sofa, expressed languid and incredulous amusement. What do you know of her? She asked the father. I know what you know, he answered, and that's enough. Father Consett, Sylvia said to her mother, has been renewing his social circle. It's not, Father Consett said, amongst the dregs of the people that you must live if you don't want to hear the dregs of society. Sylvia stood up. She said, You keep your tongue off my best friends if you want me to stop and be lectured. But for Mrs. Vanderdecken I should not be here. Return to the fold. Father Consett exclaimed, Don't say it, child. I'd rather, heaven help me, you had gone on living in open sin. Sylvia sat down again, her hands listlessly on her lap. Have it your own way, she said, and the father returned to the fourth sheet of the telegram. What does this mean? He asked. He had returned to the first sheet. This here. Accept resumption yoke, he read breathlessly. Sylvia, Mrs. Satterthwaite said, go and light the spirit lamp for some tea. I shall want it. You'd think I was a district messenger boy, Sylvia said, as she rose. Why don't you keep your maid up? It's a way we had of referring to our union, she explained to the father. There was sympathy enough between you and him then, he said, to have bywords for things. It was that I wanted to know. I understood the words. They were pretty bitter bywords, as you call them, Sylvia said, more like curses than kisses. It was you that used them then, Mrs. Satterthwaite said. Christopher never said a bitter thing to you. An expression like a grin came slowly over Sylvia's face as she turned back to the priest. That's Mother's tragedy, she said. My husband's one of her best boys. She adores him, and he can't bear her. She drifted behind the wall of the next room, and they heard her tinkling the tea things as the father read on again beside the candle. His immense shadow began at the centre and ran along the pitch-pine ceiling, down the wall and across the floor to join his splay feet in their clumsy boots. It's bad, he muttered. He made a sound like Oblium and Blum. Worse than I feared, and Blum. Accept presumption yoke, but on a rigid conditions. What's this? Is he socially? It ought to be a poor, especially regards childhood use establishment, ridiculous opposition, remake, settlements in child so interest, flat, not house, entertaining in minimum, and prepared, design offers, settle Yorkshire out, but imagine this not suits you, child, remain Sister Effie, open visits both wire, if this rough outline, provisionally acceptable in that case, will express draft, general position. Monday, for you, and Mother reflect upon, follow self Tuesday, arrive Thursday, Lupshot, go, Wiesbaden, fortnight, on social task discussion Thursday limited, solely, emphasized, 2 affairs. That means, Mrs. Satterthwaite said, that he doesn't mean to reproach her. Emphasized applies to the word solely. Why'd you take it? Father Consett asked. Did he spend an immense lot of money on this telegram? Did he imagine you were in such a trepidation? He broke off. Walking slowly, her long arms extended to carry the tea tray over, which her wonderfully moving face had a rapt expression of indescribable mystery. Sylvia was coming through the door. Oh, child, the father exclaimed. Were it Saints Martha or that Mary that made the bitter choice, not one of them ever looked more virtuous than you. Why aren't you born to be a good man's helpmeet? A little tinkle sounded from the tea tray, and 3 pieces of sugar fell on the floor. Mrs. Tegens hissed with vexation. I knew that damn thing would slide off the teacups, she said. She dropped the tray from an inch or so of height onto the carpeted table. I made it a matter of luck between myself and myself, she said. And she faced the priest. I'll tell you, she said, why he sent the telegram. It's because of that dull display of the English gentleman that I detested. He gives himself the solemn airs of the foreign minister, but he's only a youngest son at the best. That is why I loathe him. Mrs. Satterthwaite said, That isn't the reason why he sent the telegram. Her daughter had a gesture of amused, lazy tolerance. Of course it isn't, she said. He sent it out of consideration. The lordly, full-dress consideration that drives me distracted. As he would say, he'd imagine I'd find it convenient to have an ample time for reflection. It's like being addressed as if one were a monument and by a herald according to protocol. And partly because he's full of truth, like a stiff Dutch doll. He wouldn't write a letter because he couldn't, without beginning it, Dear Sylvia, and ending it, Yours sincerely, or truly, or affectionately. He's that sort of precise imbecile. I tell you, he's so formal he can't do without all the conventions that there are, and so truthful he can't use half of them. Then, Father Consett said, if you know him so well, Sylvia Satterthwaite, how is it you can't get on with him better? They say, tout savoir, c'est tout pardonner. It isn't, Sylvia said. To know everything about the person is to be bored. And how are you going to answer this telegram of his? The father asked. Or have you answered it already? I shall wait until Monday night to keep him as bothered as I can to know whether he's to start on Tuesday. He fusses like a hen over his packings and the exact hours of his movements. On Monday, I shall telegraph. Write to. And nothing else. And why, the father asked, will you telegraph him a vulgar word that you never use, for your language is the one thing about you that isn't vulgar? Sylvia said, Thanks. She curled her legs up under her on the sofa and laid her head back against the wall so that her Gothic arch of a chin bone pointed at the ceiling. She admired her own neck, which was very long and white. I know, Father Consett said. You're a beautiful woman. Some people would say it was a lucky fellow that lived with you. I don't ignore the fact in my cogitation. You'd imagine all sorts of delight to lurk in the shadow of your beautiful hair, and they wouldn't. Sylvia brought her gaze down from the ceiling and fixed her brown eyes for a moment on the priest, speculatively. It's a great handicap we suffer from, he said. I don't know why I selected that word, Sylvia said. It's one word, so it costs only 50 pfennigs. I couldn't hope really to give a jerk to his pompous self-sufficiency. It's great handicaps we priests suffer from, the father repeated. However much a priest may be a man of the world, and he has to be to fight the world. Mrs. Satterthwaite said, Have a cup of tea, father, while it's just right. I believe Sylvia is the only person in Germany who knows how to make tea. There's always behind him the Roman collar and the silk bib, and you don't believe in him, Father Consent went on. Yet he knows 1,000 times more of the human nature than ever you can. I don't see, Sylvia said placably, how you can learn in your slums anything about the nature of Eunice Vanderdecken, or Elizabeth B., or Queenie James, or any of my set. She was on her feet, pouring cream into the father's tea. I'll admit for the moment that you aren't giving me pejor. I'm glad, the priest said, that you remember enough of your school days to use the old term. Sylvia wavered backwards to a sofa and sank down again. There you are, she said. You can't really get away from the preachments. Me, for the pure young girl, is always at the back of it. It isn't, the father said. I'm not one to cry for the moon. You don't want me to be a pure young girl, Sylvia added with a lazy incredulity. I do not, the father said. But I wish that at times you'd remembered you once were. I don't believe I ever was, Sylvia said. If the nuns had known, I'd have been expelled from the Holy Child. You would not, the father said. Do stop your boasting. The nuns have too much sense. Anyhow, it isn't a pure young girl I'd have you or behaving like a Protestant deaconess for the craven fear of hell. I'd have you be a physically healthy, decently honest with yourself, young devil of a married woman. It's them that's the plague and the salvation of the world. You admire mother, Mrs. Tegens asked suddenly. She added in parentheses, You see, you can't get away from salvation. I mean keeping bread and butter in their husbands' stomachs, the priest said. Of course I admire your mother. Mrs. Satterthwaite moved a hand slightly. You're at any rate in league with her against me, Sylvia said. She asked with more interest. Then would you have me model myself on her and do good works to escape hellfire? She wears a hair shirt in Lent. Mrs. Satterthwaite started from a doze on the edge of a chair. She had been trusting the father's wit to give her daughter's insolence a run for its money, and she imagined that if the priest hit hard enough, he might, at least, make Sylvia think a little about some of her ways. Hang it, no, Sylvia, she exclaimed more suddenly. I may not be much, but I am a sportsman. I'm afraid of hellfire. Horribly, I'll admit, but I don't bargain with the Almighty. I hope he'll let me through, but I'd go on trying to pick men out of the dirt. I suppose that's what you and Father Consent meant if I were as certain of going to hell as I'm going to bed tonight. So that's that. And lo, Ben Adams' name led all the rest. Sylvia jeered softly. All the same, I bet you wouldn't bother to proclaim men if you could not find the young, good-looking, interestingly vicious sort. I wouldn't, Mrs. Satterthwaite said. If they didn't interest me, why would I? Sylvia looked at Father Consent. If you're going to trounce me any more, she said, get to move on. It's late. I've been travelling for 36 hours. I will, Father Consent said. It's a good maxim that you swat flies enough, some of them stick to the wall. I'm only trying to make a little mark in your common sense. Don't you see that you're going to? What? Sylvia said indifferently. Hell? No, the father said. I'm talking of this life. Your confessor must talk to you about the next, but not tell you what you're going to do. I've changed my mind. I'll tell your mother after you're gone. Tell me, Sylvia said. I'll not, Father Consent answered. Go to the fortune-tellers at the Earl's Court exhibition. They'll tell you all about the fair woman you're to be aware of. There's some of them said to be rather good, Sylvia said. Dee Wilson's told me about one. She said she was going to have a baby. You don't mean that, Father? For I swear I never will. I dare say not, the priest said. But let's talk about men. There's nothing you can tell me I don't know, Sylvia said. I dare say not, the priest answered. But let's rehearse what you do know. Now, suppose you could elope with a new man every week and no questions asked? Or how often would you want to? Sylvia said, "Just a moment, father." And she addressed Mrs. Satterthwaite. "I suppose I shall have to put myself to bed." "You will," Mrs. Satterthwaite said. "I'll not have any maid kept up after 10 in a holiday resort. What's she to do in a place like this, except listen for the bogies it's full of?" "Always considerate," Mrs. Tegan gibed. "And perhaps it's just as well. I'd probably beat that Mary of yours arms to pieces with a hairbrush if she came near me," she added. "You were talking about men, father," and then began with a sudden animation to her mother. "I've changed my mind about that telegram. The first thing tomorrow I shall wire. Agreed entirely, but arrange bring Hello Central with you." She addressed the priest again. "I call my husband Hello Central because he's got a tiny, tinny voice like a telephone. I say, 'Hello, Central,' when she answers. 'Yes, madam, you swear it was the exchange speaking, but you were telling me about men.' 'I was reminding you,' the father said. 'But I need to go on. You caught the drift of my remarks. That is why you are pretending not to listen.' 'I assure you, no,' Mrs. Tegan said. 'It is simply that if a thing comes into my mind, I have to say it. You were saying that if one went away with a different man for every weekend.' 'You've shortened the period already,' the priest said. 'I gave a full week to every man.' 'Oh, but of course, one would have had to have a home,' Sylvia said. 'An address. One would have to fill one's midweek engagements. Really, it comes to it that one has to have a husband and a place to store one's maid in. Hello Central's been on board wages all the time, but I don't believe she likes it. Let's agree that if I had a different man every week, I'd be bored with the arrangement. That's what you're getting at, isn't it?' 'You'd find,' the priest said, 'that it's whittled down the only divvy moments. That was when you stood waiting in the book office for the young man to take the tickets. Then gradually that wouldn't be divvy anymore, and you'd yawn and long go back to your husband.' 'Okay,' Mrs. Tegan said. 'You're abusing the secrets of the confessional. That's exactly what Toty Charles said. She tried it for 3 months while Freddie Charles was in Madeira. That's exactly what she said, down to the yawn in the book office. And the divvy. It's only Toty Charles who uses it every 2 words. Most of us prefer ripping. It is more sensible.' 'Of course I haven't been amusing the secrets of the confessional,' Father Consett said mildly. 'Of course you haven't,' Sylvia said with the affection. 'You're a good old stick and no end of a mimic, and you know us all to the bottom of our hearts.' 'Not all that much,' the priest said. 'There's probably a good deal of good at the bottom of your hearts.' Sylvia said. 'Thanks,' she asked suddenly. 'Look here, was it what you saw of us, the future mothers of England, you know, and all, at Miss Lampeter's that made you take to the slums? Out of disgust and despair?' 'Oh, let's not make a melodrama out of it,' the priest answered. 'Let's say I wanted a change. I didn't see that I was doing any good.' 'You did us all the good that there was done,' Sylvia said. 'What with Miss Lampeter always drugged to the world, and all the French mistresses as wicked as hell.' 'I've heard you say all this before,' Mrs. Satterthwaite said. 'But it was supposed to be the best finishing school in England. I know it cost enough.' 'Well, say it was we who were a rotten lot,' Sylvia concluded, and then to Father, 'We were a lot of rotters, weren't we?' The priest answered, 'I don't know. I don't suppose you were, or any worse than your mother or grandmother, or the patronesses of Rome, or the worshippers of Astaroth. It seems we have had a governing class, and governing classes are subject to special temptations.' 'Who's Astaroth?' Sylvia asked. 'A starter?' And then, 'Now, Father, After your experiences, would you say the factory girls of Liverpool or any other slum are any better than women than us that you used to look after? Astarte Siraka, the father said, was a very powerful devil. There's some that hold that she's not dead yet. I don't know that I do myself. Well, I've done with her, Sylvia said. The father nodded. You've had dealings with Mrs. Profumo? He asked. And that loathsome fellow, what's his name? Does it shock you? Sylvia asked. I'll admit it was a bit thick, but I've done with it. I prefer to pin my faith in Mrs. Vanderdecken, and, of course, Freud. The priest nodded his head and said, Of course. But Mrs. Satterthwaite exclaimed with a sudden energy, Sylvia Teagens, I don't care what you do or what you read, but if you ever speak another word to that woman, you never do to me. Sylvia stretched herself on the sofa. She opened her brown eyes wide and let the lids slowly drop again. I've said once, she said, that I don't like to hear my friends miscalled. Eunice Vanderdecken is a bitterly misjudged woman. She's a real good pal. She's a Russian spy, Mrs. Satterthwaite said. Russian grandmother, Sylvia answered. And if she is, who cares? She's welcome for me. Listen now, you two. I said to myself when I came in, I dare say I've given them both a rotten time. I know you're both more nuts on me than I deserve. And I said I'd sit and listen to all the pejor you wanted to give me if I sat till dawn. And I will, as a return. But I'd rather you let my friends alone. Both the elder people were silent. There came from the shuttered windows of the dark room a low, scratching rustle. You hear? The priest said to Mrs. Satterthwaite. It's the branches, Mrs. Satterthwaite answered. The father answered. There's no tree within 10 yards. Try bats as an explanation. I've said I wished you wouldn't, once. Mrs. Satterthwaite shivered. Sylvia said. I don't know what you two are talking about. It sounds like superstition. Mother's rotten with it. I don't say that it's devils trying to get in, Father said. But it's just as well to remember that devils are always trying to get in. And there are special spots. These deep forests are noted among others. He suddenly turned his back and pointed to the shadowy wall. Who, he asked, but a savage possessed by a devil could have conceived of that as a decoration? He was pointing at a life-size, coarsely daubed picture of a wild boar dying, its throat cut in gouts of scarlet blood. Other agonies of animals went away into all the shadows. Sport, he hissed. It's devilry. That's perhaps true, Sylvia said. Mrs. Satterthwaite was crossing herself with great rapidity. The silence remained. Sylvia said, Then if you're both done talking, I'll say that I have to say. To begin with, she stopped, and sat rather erect, listening to the rustling from the shutters. To begin with, she began, again with impetus, you spare me the catalogue of the defects of age. I know them. One grows skinny, my sort, and the complexion fades, the teeth stick out, and then there is the boredom. I know it. One is bored. You can't tell me anything I don't know about that. I'm 30. I know what to expect. You'd like to have told me, Father, only you were afraid of taking away from your famous man-of-the-world effect. You'd like to have told me that one can insure against the boredom and the long, skinny teeth by the love of a husband and child. The home stunt. I believe it. I do quite believe it. Only, I hate my husband. And I hate my child. She paused, waiting for exclamations of dismay, or disapprobation from the husband, from the priest. He did not come. Think, she said, of all the ruin that child has meant for me, the pain of bearing him and the fear of death. Of course, the priest said, childbearing is for women a very terrible thing. I can't say, Mrs. Teachins went on, that this has been a very decent conversation. You get a girl, fresh from open sin, and make her talk about it. Of course you're a priest and mother's mother, very en famille. But Sister Mary of the Cross of the Covenant had a maxim. Wear velvet gloves in family life. We seem to be going at it with the gloves off. Father Consett still didn't say anything. You're trying, of course, to draw me, Sylvia said. I can see that with half an eye. Very well, then. You shall. She drew a breath. You want to know why I hate my husband? I'll tell you. It's because of his simple, sheer immorality. I don't mean his actions, his views. Every speech he utters about everything makes me, I swear it makes me, in spite of myself, want to stick a knife into him. And I can't prove he's wrong, not ever, about the simplest thing. But I can pain him, and I will. He sits about in chairs that fit his back. Clumsy, like a rock, not moving for hours. And I can make him wince. Oh, without showing it. He's what you call, loyal. As an absurd little chit of a fellow. Oh, McMaster and his mother, whom he persists a silly mystical way in calling a saint. A Protestant saint. And his own nurse who looks after the child. And the child itself, I tell you, I've only got to raise an eyelid. Yes, cock an eyelid up and when any one of them is mentioned. And it hurts him dreadfully. His eyes roll in a sort of mute anguish. Of course, he doesn't say anything. He's an English country gentleman. Father Consett said, This immorality you talk about in your husband, I never noticed it. I saw a good deal of him when I talked with him a great deal. I stayed with you for the week before your child was born. Except in matters of the 2 communions, and even in these I don't know what we suffered and differed so much, I found him perfectly sound. Sound, Mrs. Satterthwaite said with a sudden emphasis. Of course he's sound. It isn't even the word. He's the best ever. That was your father, for a good man. And him. That's end of it. Oh, Sylvia said, you don't know. Look here, try and be just. Suppose I'm looking at the Times at breakfast and say, not having spoken to him for a week, it's wonderful that the doctors are doing. Have you seen the latest? And at once he'll be on his high horse, he knows everything, and he'll prove that all the unhealthy children must be lethal chambered or in the world will go to pieces. And it's like being hypnotized. You can't think of what to answer him. Or he'll reduce it to speechless rage by proving that murderers ought not to be executed. And then I'll ask, casually, if children ought to be lethal chambered, for being constipated. Because Marchant, that's the nurse, is always whining that the child's bowels aren't regular and the dreadful diseases that leads to. Of course, that hurts him, for he's perfectly soppy about that child, though he half knows it isn't his own. But that's what I mean by immorality. He'll profess that murderers ought to be preserved in order to breed from being, because they'd bold fellows, and innocent little children executed because they're sick. And he'll almost make you believe, although you're on the point of retching at the ideas. You wouldn't now, Father Consett began, and almost coaxingly, think of going into retreat for a month or 2? I wouldn't, Sylvia said. How could I? There's a convent of female Wait. There's a convent of female premonstrations near Birkenhead. Many ladies go there. The father began and went on. They cook very well, and you can have your own furniture and your own maid if you don't like nuns to wait on you. It can't be done, Sylvia said. You can see for yourself. It would make people smell a rat at once. Christopher wouldn't hear of it. No, I'm afraid it can't be done, Father, Mrs. Satterthwaite interrupted finally. I've hidden here for 4 months to cover Sylvia's tracks. I got wait twins to look after. My new land steward's coming in next week. Still, the father urged, with a sort of tremulous eagerness. If only for a month, if only for a fortnight, so many Catholic ladies do it, you might think of it. I see what you're aiming at, Sylvia said with sudden anger. You're revolted at the idea of me going straight for one man's arms to another. I'd be better pleased if there could be an interval, the father said. It's what's called bad form. Sylvia became electrically rigid on the sofa. Bad form, she exclaimed. You accuse me of bad form. The father slightly bowed his head like a man facing a wind. I do, he said. It's disgraceful. It's unnatural. I'd travel a bit, at least. She placed a hand on her long throat. I know what you mean, she said. You want to spare Christopher. The humiliation. The nausea. No doubt he'll feel nauseated. I reckon on that. It'll give me a little my own back. The father said, That's enough, woman. I hear no more. Sylvia said, You will then. Listen here. I've always got this to look forward to. I've set her down by that man's side. I'll be as virtuous as any woman. I've made up my mind to do it, and I'll be it. I'll be bored stiff for the rest of my life. Except for one thing. I can torment that man. And I'll do it. Do you understand how I'll do it? There are many ways. But if the worst comes to worst, and I can always drive him silly by corrupting the child. She was panting a little, and round her brown eyes the white showed. I'll get even with him. I can. I know how, you see, and with you, through him, for tormenting me. I come all the way from Brittany without stopping. I haven't slept. But I can... Father Consett put his hands beneath the tail of his coat. Sylvia Teagens, he said. In my pistol pocket I have a little bottle of holy water, which I carry for such occasions. What if I was to throw 2 drops of it over you and cry? She erected her body above his skirt on the sofa, stiffened like a snake's neck above its coils. Her face was quite pallid, her eyes staring out. You daren't, she said. To me? An outrage! Her feet slid slowly to the floor. She measured the distance to the doorway with her eyes. You daren't, she said again. I denounce you to the bishop. It's little the bishop would help you with them burning into your skin, the priest said. Go away, I bid you, and say a Hail Mary or 2. You need them. Do not talk of corrupting a little child before me again. I won't, Sylvia said. I shouldn't have. Her black figure showed in silhouette against the open doorway. When the door was closed upon them, Mrs. Satterthwaite said, Was it necessary to threaten her with that? You know best, of course. It seems rather strong to me. It's a hair from the dog that's bitter, the priest said. She's a silly girl. She's been playing at black masses, along with that Mrs. Profumo and the fellow whose name I can't remember. You could tell that. They cut the throat of a white kid and splashed its blood about. That was the back of her mind. It's not very serious. A past of silly, idle girls. It's not much more than palmistry or fortune-telling to them if one has to weigh it, for all its ugliness, as a sin. As far as the volition goes, and its volition, that's the essence of prayer, black or white. But it was at the back of her mind, and she won't forget tonight. Of course, that's your affair, Father, Mrs. Satterthwaite said lazily. You hit her pretty hard. I don't suppose she's ever been hit so hard. What was it you wouldn't tell her? Only, the priest said, I wouldn't tell her because she thoughts best not to put in her head. But a hell on earth will come, and her husband goes running, blind, head down, mad after another woman. Mrs. Satterthwaite looked at nothing. Then she nodded. Yes, she said. I hadn't thought of that. But really? He is a very sound fellow, isn't he? What's to stop it? The priest asked. What in the world but the grace of our blessed Lord, which he hasn't got and doesn't ask for? And then he's a young man, full-blooded, and they won't be living. Retaliment, not if I know him. And then she'll tear the house down. The world will echo with her wrongs. Do you mean to say, Mrs. Satterthwaite said, that Sylvia would do anything vulgar? Doesn't every woman who's had a man to torture for years when she loses him? The priest asked. The more she's made an occupation of torturing him, the less right she thinks she has to lose him. Mrs. Satterthwaite looked gloomily into the dusk. That poor devil, she said. Will he get any peace anywhere? What's the matter, Father? The father said, I've just remembered she gave me the tea and cream and I drank it. Now I can't take Mass for Father Reinhardt. I have to go and knock up his curate, who lives away in the forest. At the door, holding the candle, he said, I'd have you not get up today, nor yet tomorrow, if you can stand it. Have a headache, and let Sylvia nurse you. I'll have to tell her how she nursed you when you get back to London, and I'd rather you didn't lie more out more than you need, if it's to please me. Besides, if you watch Sylvia nursing you, you might hit on a characteristic touch to make it seem more truthful. How her sleeves brushed the medicine bottles and irritated you, maybe. Or you'll know. If we can save a scandal to the congregation, we may as well. He ran downstairs. 3. At the slight creaking made by McMaster in pushing open his door, Tegan stared and started violently. He was sitting in a smoking jacket, playing Patience engrossedly in a sort of garret bedroom. Had a sloping roof outlined by black oak beams which cut into squares the cream-coloured patterned distemper of the walls. The room contained also a four-post bedstead, a corner covered in a black oak, and many rush mats on a polished oak floor of very irregular planking. Tegens, who hated these disinterred and wax relics of the past, sat in the centre of the room at a flimsy card table beneath a white-shaded electric light of a brilliance that, in those surroundings, appeared unreasonable. This was one of those restored old groups of cottages that it was that date the fashion to convert into hostelries. To it McMaster, who was in search of the inspiration of the past, had preferred to come. Tegens, not desiring to interfere with his friend's culture, had accepted the quarters, though he would have preferred to go to a comfortable modern hotel, as being less affected and cheaper. Accustomed to what he called the grown oldnesses of a morose, rambling Yorkshire manor house, he disliked being among collected and rather pitiful bits which, he said, made him feel ridiculous, as if he were trying to behave seriously at a fancy dress ball. McMaster, on the other hand, with a gratification and serious air, would run his fingertips along the bevelings of a darkened piece of furniture and would declare it genuine, Chippendale, or Jacobean oak, as the case might be. And he seemed to gain an added seriousness and weight of manner with each piece of ancient furniture that ran down the years he thus touched. But Tietjens would declare that you could tell the beastly thing was fake just by cocking an eye at it, and if the matter happened to fall under the test of professional dealers in old furniture, Tietjens was the more often in the right of it. And McMaster, sighing slightly, would prepare to proceed still further along the difficult road to connoisseurship. Eventually, by conscientious study, he got so far as times to be called in by Somerset House to value great properties for probate, an occupation at once distinguished and highly profitable. Tietjens swore with the extreme vehemence of a man who had been made, but who much dislikes being seen, to start. McMaster, in evening dress, he looked extremely miniature, said, "I'm sorry, old man. I know how much you dislike being interrupted, but the General is in terrible temper." Tietjens rose stiffly, lurched over in the 18th century rosewood folding washstand, took from its top a glass of flat whisky and soda, and gulped down a large quantity. He looked about uncertainly, perceived a notebook on a Chippendale bureau, and made a short calculation in pencil, and looked at his friend momentarily. McMaster said again, "I'm sorry, old man, I must have interrupted one of your immense calculations." Tietjens said, "You haven't. I was only thinking. I'm just as glad you've come." "What did you say?" McMaster repeated, "I said the General is in a terrible temper. It's just as well you didn't come up to dinner." Tietjens said, He isn't in a bad temper. He's as pleased as Punch's not having to have these women up before him." McMaster said, "He says he's got the police scouring the whole county for them, and that you'd better leave by the first train tomorrow." Tietjens said, "I won't. I can't. I got to wait here for a wire from Sylvia." McMaster groaned. "Oh dear, oh dear." Then he said hopefully, "Well, we could have it forwarded to Hythe." Tietjens said with some vehemence, "I tell you I won't leave here. I tell you I've settled it with the police and that swine of a cabinet minister. I've mended the leg of the cannery of his wife and the police constable. Sit down and be reasonable. The police don't touch people like us." McMaster said, "I don't believe you realize the public feeling there is." "Of course I do, amongst people like Sandbach." Tietjens said, "Sit down, I tell you. Have some whiskey." He filled himself out another long tumbler and, holding it, dropped into a too low-seated reddish wicker armchair that had cretonne fixings. Beneath its weight, the chair sagged a good deal, and his dress shirt front bulged up to his chin. McMaster said, "What's the matter with you?" Tietjens' eyes were bloodshot. "I tell you," Tietjens said, "I'm waiting for a wire from Sylvia." McMaster said, "Oh!" and then, "I can't come tonight. It's getting on for 1. "It can," Tietjens said. "I fixed it up with the postmaster, all the way up to town. It probably won't come because Sylvia won't send it until the last moment to bother me. Nonetheless, I'm waiting for a wire from Sylvia, and this is what I look like." McMaster said, "That woman's the cruelest beast." "You might," Tietjens interrupted. "Remember that you're talking about my wife." "I don't see," McMaster said, "how one can talk about Sylvia without—" "The line is a perfectly simple one to draw," Tietjens said. "You can relate a lady's actions if you know them and are asked to. You mustn't comment. In this case, you don't know the lady's actions even, so you may as well hold your tongue. He sat looking straight in front of him. McMaster sighed from deep in his chest. He asked himself if this was what 16 hours waiting had done for his friend. What were all the remaining hours going to do? Tegan said, I shall be fit to talk about Sylvia after 2 more whiskies. Let's settle your other perturbations first. The fair girl is called Wannop. Valentine Wannop. That's the professor's name, McMaster said. She's the late Professor Wannop's daughter, Tegan said. She's also the daughter of the novelist. McMaster interjected. But she supported herself for a year after the professor's death as a domestic servant, Tegan said. Now she's housemaid for her mother, the novelist, in an inexpensive cottage. I should imagine the 2 experiences would have made her desire to better the lot of her sex. McMaster began interjected, again. But I got that information from the policeman whilst I was putting his wife's cannery leg in splints. McMaster said, The policeman you knocked down? His eyes expressed unreasoning surprise. He added, He knew Miss Wannop, then. You would not expect much intelligence from the police of Sussex, Tegan said. But you would be wrong. P.C. Finn is clever enough to recognize the young lady for several years past has managed the constabulary's wives and children's annual tea and sports. He says Miss Wannop holds the quarter-mile, half-mile, high jump, long jump and putting the weight records of East Sussex. That explains how she went over that dike in such tidy style. I'm precious glad the stood simple man was when I told him he was to leave the girl alone. He didn't know, he said, how he'd ever had a face to serve the warrant on Miss Wannop. The other girl, the one that's sweet, is a stranger, a Londoner probably. McMaster said, You told the policeman. I gave him, Tegan said. Wait. I gave him Hun Stephen Fenwick Waterhouse's compliments, and he'd be much obliged if the PC would hand it in a no-can-do report in the matter of those ladies every morning to his inspector. I gave him also a brand new £5 note from the cabinet minister, and a couple of quid in the price of a new pair of trousers for myself. So, he's the happiest constable in Sussex. A very decent fellow. He told me how to know a dog's utter spore from a gravid bitches. But that wouldn't interest you. They began again. Don't look so inexpressibly foolish. I told you I'd been dining with that swine. No, I oughtn't to call him a swine after eating his dinner. Besides, he's a very decent fellow. You didn't tell me you'd been dining with Mr. Waterhouse, McMaster said. I hope you remember that, as he's, amongst other things, the president of the Funded Debts Commission. He's the power of life and death over the department and us. You didn't think, Tegan answered, that you are the only one to dine with the great ones of the earth. I wanted to talk to that fellow, but those figures, that cursed crowd, made me fake. I meant to give him a bit of my mind. You didn't, McMaster said with an expression of panic. Besides, they didn't ask you to fake the calculation. They only asked you to work it out on the basis of given figures. I know, Tegan said. I gave him a bit of my mind. I told him that at 3 pence he must run the country, and certainly himself as a politician to absolute ruin. McMaster uttered a deep, good Lord, and then, but won't you ever remember you're a government servant? He could. Mr. Waterhouse, Tegan said, asked me if I wouldn't consent to be transferred to his secretary's department, and when I said, go to hell, he walked to the streets with me for 2 hours arguing. I was working out the chances on a 4.5 basis for him when you interrupted me. I promised to let him have the figures when he goes by up the 1:30 on Monday. McMaster said, You haven't, but by Jove, you're the only man in England who could do it. That was what Mr. Waterhouse said, Tidgens commented. He said old Ingleby had told him so. I do hope so, McMaster said, that you answered him politely. I told him, Tidgens answered, that there were a dozen men who could do it as well as I, and I mentioned your name in particular. But I couldn't, McMaster answered. Of course I could convert a 3D rate into 4.5D. But these are the actuarial variations. They're infinite. I couldn't touch them. Tidgens said negligently, I don't want my name mixed up in the unspeakable affair. When I give him the papers on Monday, I shall tell him you did most of the work. Again, McMaster groaned. Nor was this distress mere altruism. Immensely ambitious for his brilliant friend, McMaster's ambition was one ingredient of his strong desire for security. At Cambridge he had been perfectly content with moderate, quite respectable place on the list of mathematical postulants. He knew that made him safe, and he had still more satisfaction in the thought that it would warrant him in never being brilliant in afterlife. But when Tidgens, 2 years after, had come out as a mere second wrangler, McMaster had been bitterly and loudly disappointed. He knew perfectly well that Tidgens simply hadn't taken trouble, and 10 chances to 1, it was on purpose that Tidgens hadn't taken trouble. For the matter of that, for Tidgens, it wouldn't have been trouble. And indeed, to McMaster's upbraidings, which McMaster hadn't spared him, Tidgens had answered that he hadn't been able to think of going through the rest of his life with a beastly placard like Senior Wrangler hung around his neck. But McMaster had early made up his mind that life for him would be safest if he could go about, not very much observed, but still in an authority, in the midst of a body of men all labelled. He wanted to walk down Pall Mall on the arm, precisely, of a largely lettered Senior Wrangler, to return eastward on the arm of the youngest Lord Chancellor England ever seen, to stroll down Whitehall in familiar converse of the world-famous novelist, saluting on the way a majority of my lords commissioners of the Treasury, and after tea, for an hour in the club, all these, in a little group, should treat him with the courtesy of men who respected him for his soundness. Then he would be safe. And he had no doubt that Tidgens was the most brilliant man in England of that day, so that nothing caused him more anguish than the thought that Tidgens might not make a brilliant and rapid career towards some illustrious position in the public services. He would very willingly, he desired indeed nothing better, have seen Tidgens pass over his own head. It did not seem to him a condemnation of the public services that this appeared to be to be unlikely. Yet McMaster was still not without hope. He was quite aware that there are other techniques of careers than that which he had prescribed for himself. He could not imagine himself, even in the most deferential way, correcting a superior. Yet he could see that, though Tidgens treated him almost every hierarch as if he had been born a fool, no one very much resented it. Of course, Tidgens was a Tidgens of Groby, but was that going to be enough to live on forever? Times were changing, and McMaster imagined that this to be a democratic age. But Tidgens went on, with both hands as it were, throwing away opportunity and committing outrage. That day McMaster could only consider to be one of disaster. He got up from his chair and filled himself another drink. He felt himself to be distressed and to need it. Slouching among his cretonnes, Tidgens was gazing in front of him. He said, "Here," without looking at McMaster, and held out his long glass. Into it McMaster poured whiskey with a hesitating hand. Tidgens said, "Go on." McMaster said, It's late. We're breakfasting at Dukeman's at 10. Tegens answered. Don't worry, Sonny. I'll be there for your pretty lady, he added. Wait another quarter of an hour. I want to talk to you. McMaster sat down again and deliberately began to review the day. It had begun with disaster, and in disaster it had continued. And, with something like a bitter irony, McMaster remembered and brought up now for digestion the parting words of General Campion himself. The General had limped with him to the hall door up at Mountsie, and, standing, patting him on the shoulder, tall, slightly bent, and very friendly, had said, "Look here, Christopher Tegens is a splendid fellow, but he needs a good woman to look after him. Get him back to Sylvia as quick as you can. Had a little tiff, haven't they? Nothing serious. Chrissy hasn't been running after the skirts? No? I dare say a little. No? Well then." McMaster stood like a gatepost, so appalled. Yet stutters. No. We've known them, both, so long, the General went on. Lady Claudine in particular. And believe me, Sylvia's a splendid girl. Straight as a die, the soul of loyalty to her friends, and fearless. She'd face the devil in his rage. You should have seen her out with the Belvoir. Of course you know her. Well then. McMaster had just managed to say that he knew Sylvia, of course. Well then, the General continued, you'll agree with me that if there is anything wrong between them, he's to blame. And it will be resented. Very bitterly. He would set foot in this house again not. But he says he's going out to her and Mrs. Satterthwaite. I believe, McMaster had begun, I believe he is. Well then, the General had said, it's all right. Christine needs a good woman's backing. He's a splendid fellow. There are few young fellows for whom I have more, I could almost say, respect. But he needs that. To ballast him. In the car, running down the hill from Mont B, McMaster had exhausted himself in the effort to restrain his execrations of the General. He wanted to shout that he was a pig-headed old fool, a meddlesome ass. But he was in the car with the two secretaries of the cabinet minister. Edward Fenwick Waterhouse, who had been himself an advanced Liberal down for a weekend of golf, preferred not to dine at the house of the Conservative member. At the date, there was, in politics, a phase of bitter social feud between the parties, a condition that had not till lately been characteristic of English political life. The prohibition had not extended itself to the two younger men. McMaster was not unpleasurably aware that these two fellows treated him with a certain deference. They had seen McMaster being talked to familiarly by General Lord Edward Campion. Indeed, they and the car had been kept waiting whilst the General patted their fellow guest on the shoulder, held his upper arm and spoke in a low voice into his ear. But that was the only pleasure that McMaster got out of it. Yes, the day had begun disastrously, with Sylvia's letter. It ended, if it was ended, almost more disastrously, with beeswax. What pictures there were, McMaster recognised at once as being Ian Solomon, one of the weaker and more frail aesthetes. Aureoled, palish heads of ladies carrying lilies that they were not very like lilies. They were in the tradition, but not the best of the tradition. McMaster understood, and later Mrs. Dukeman confirmed him in the idea that Mr. Dukeman kept his more precious specimens of work in a sanctum, leaving to the relatively public room, good-humouredly and with slight contempt, these weaker specimens. That seemed to stamp Mr. Dukeman at once as being of the elect. Mr. Dukeman, in person, was, however, not present, and there seemed to be a good deal of difficulty in arranging a meeting between the two men. Mr. Dukeman, his wife said, was much occupied in the weekends. She added, with a faint and rather absent smile, the word naturally. McMaster at once saw that it was natural for a clergyman to be much occupied during the weekends. With a little hesitation, Mrs. Dukeman suggested that Mr. McMaster and his friend might come to lunch on the next day, Saturday. But McMaster had made an engagement to play the foursome with General Campion, half the round from 12 till 1:30, half the round from 3 to half past 4. And, as their then present arrangement stood, McMaster and Teasons were to take the 6:30 train to Hythe, then ruled out either tea or dinner next day. With sufficient, but not too extravagant, regret, Mrs. Dukeman raised her voice to say, "Oh dear, but you must see my husband in the pictures after you have come so far." A rather considerable volume of harsh sound was coming through the end of the wall of the room. The barking of dogs, apparently the hurried removal of pieces of furniture, or perhaps the packing of cases, guttural ejaculations. Mrs. Dukeman said, with a far-away air and deep voice, "They're making a good deal of noise. Let's go into the garden and look at my husband's roses, if you've a moment more to give us." McMaster quoted to himself, "I looked and saw your eyes in the shadow of your hair." There was no doubt that Mrs. Dukeman's eyes, which were of a dark pebble blue, were actually in the shadow of her blue-black, very regularly waved hair. The hair came down on a square, low forehead. It was a phenomenon that McMaster had never before really seen, and he congratulated himself this was one more confirmation, if confirmation were needed, of the powers of observation of the subject of his monograph. Mrs. Dukeman bore the sunlight. Her dark complexion was clear. There was, over the cheekbones, a delicate suffusion of light carmine. Her jawbone was singularly clear-cut to the pointed chin, like an alabaster medieval saint's. She said, "Of course you're Scotch. I'm from Ardrakey myself." McMaster would have known it. He said he was from the port of Lythe. He could not imagine hiding anywhere from Mrs. Dukeman. Mrs. Dukeman said with renewed insistence, "Oh, but of course you must see my husband and the pictures. Let me see. I must think. Oh, breakfast now." McMaster said that he and his friend were government servants and up to rising early. He had a great desire to breakfast in that house. She said, "At 9:45 then. Our car will be at the bottom of your street. It's a matter of 10 minutes only, so you won't get hungry long." She said, gradually gaining animation, that of course McMaster would bring his friend. He could tell Teasons that he should meet a very charming girl. She stopped and added suddenly, "Probably, at any rate." She said the name which McMaster caught as Wanstead, and possibly another girl. And Mr. Horsted, or something like that, her husband, a junior curate. She said reflectively, "Yes, we might try quite a party," and added, "Quite noisy and gay. I hope your friend's talkative." McMaster said something about trouble. "Oh, it can't be too much trouble," she said. "Besides, it might do my husband good," she went on. "Mr. Dukeman is apt to brood. It's perhaps too lonely here," and added the rather astonishing words, "after all." And, driving back in the fly, McMaster said to himself that you couldn't call Mrs. Dukeman ordinary, at least. Yet meeting her was like going into a room that you had long left and never ceased to love. It felt good. It was perhaps partly her Edinburghness. McMaster allowed himself to coin that word. There was in Edinburgh a society. Himself had never been privileged to move in it, but its annals were part of the literature of Scotland, where the ladies are all great ladies in tall drawing rooms, circumspect yet shrewd, still yet with a sense of the comic, frugal yet warmly hospitable. It was perhaps just Edinburghness that was wanting in the drawing rooms of his friends in London. Mrs. Cressy, the Honourable Mrs. Lemoe, and Mrs. Delaunay were all almost perfection in manner, in speech, in composure. But then, they were not young, they weren't Edinburgh, and they weren't strikingly elegant. Mrs. Jukeman was all three. Her assured, tranquil manner she would retain to any age. It betokened the enigmatic soul of her sex. But physically, she couldn't be more than 30. That was unimportant, for she would never want to do anything in which physical youth counted. She would never, for instance, have occasion to run. She would always just move, floatingly. He tried to remember the details of her dress. It had certainly been dark blue, and certainly of silk, that rather coarsely woven, exquisite material that has on its folds as of silvery shimmer with minute knots. But very dark blue, and it contrived to be at once artistic, absolutely in the tradition, and yet well cut. Very large sleeves, of course, but still with a certain fit. She had worn an immense necklace of yellow polished amber on the dark blue, and Mrs. Jukeman had said over her husband's roses that the blossoms always reminded her of little mouldings of pink cloud coming down for the cooling of the earth. A charming thought. Suddenly he said to himself, "What a mate for Tegens!" And his mind added, "Why should she not become an influence?" A vista opened before him. In time, he imagined Tegens in some way proprietarily responsible for Mrs. Jukeman. Quite pour le bon, tranquilly passionate and accepted. Motif, and immensely improved by the association. And himself, in a year or two, bringing the at last found lady of his delight to sit at the feet of Mrs. Jukeman. The lady of his delight, while circumspect, would be also young and impressionable, to learn the mysterious assuredness of manner, the gift of dressing, the knack of wearing amber and bending over standard roses, and the Edinburghness. McMaster was thus not a little excited in finding Tegens at tea amidst the green-stained furnishings and illustrated papers of the large, corrugated iron golf-house. He could not help exclaiming, I've accepted the invitation to the breakfast with the Jukemans tomorrow for both of us. Hope you won't mind?" Although Tegan was sitting at a little table with General Cambion and his brother-in-law, the Honourable Paul Sandbach, Conservative member for the division, husband of Lady Claudine. The General said pleasantly to Tegens, "Breakfast, but Jukeman, you go, my boy. You get the best breakfast you ever had in your life." He added to his brother-in-law, "Not the eternal mockery of Claudine. Gives us every morning." Sandbach grunted. "It's not for want of trying to steal that cook. Claudine has is shy at it every time we come down here." The General said pleasantly to McMaster. He spoke always pleasantly, with a half-smile and a slight sibilance. "My brother-in-law isn't serious, you understand. My sister wouldn't think of stealing a cook, let alone from Jukeman. She'd be frightened too." Sandbach grunted. Who wouldn't? Both of these gentlemen were very lame. Mrs. Sandbach from birth, and the General as the result of a slight but neglected motor accident. He had practically only one vanity, the belief that he was qualified to act as his own chauffeur, and since he was both inexpert and very careless, he met with frequent accidents. Mrs. Sandbach had a dark, round, bulldog face and a violent manner. He had twice been suspended from his parliamentary duties for applying to the then Chancellor of the Exchequer of the epithet lying attorney, and he was at that moment still suspended. McMaster then became unpleasantly perturbed. With his sensitiveness, he was perfectly aware of an unpleasant chill in the air. There was also a stiffness about Tejan's eyes. He was looking straight before him. There was silence too. Behind Tejan's back there were two men with bright green coats, red knitted waistcoats, and florid faces. One was bald and blonde, the other had black hair, remarkably oiled and shiny. Both were 45-ish. They were regarding the occupants of the Tejan's table with both their mouths slightly open. They were undisguisedly listening. In front of them, of each, were 3 empty sloe gin glasses and 1 half-filled tumbler of brandy and soda. McMaster understood why the General had explained that his sister had not tried to steal Mrs. Dukeman's cook. Tejan said, "Drink up your tea quickly and let's get started." He was drawing up from his pocket a number of telegraph forms which he began arranging. The General said, "Don't burn your mouth. We can't start off before all these other gentlemen. We're too slow." "No, we're basically well stuck," Sandbach said. Tejan handed the telegraph forms over to McMaster. "You'd better take a look at these," he said. "I mayn't see you again today after the match. You're dining up at Mountby. The General will run you up. Lady Claude will excuse me. I got work to do." This was already matter for dismay for McMaster. He was aware the Tejans would have disliked dining up at Mountby with the Sandbachs. It would have a crowd extremely smart, but more than unusually unintelligent. Tejans called the crowd indeed the plague spot of the party, meaning of Toryism. But McMaster couldn't help thinking that a disagreeable dinner would be better for his friend than brooding in solitude in the black shadows of the huddled town. Then Tejan said, "I'm going to have a word with that swine." He pointed his square chin rather rigidly before him, and looking past the 2 brandy drinkers, McMaster saw one of those faces that frequent caricature made familiar and yet strange. McMaster couldn't, at the moment, put a name to it. It must be a politician, probably a minister. But which? His mind was already in a dreadful state. In a glimpse he had caught at the telegraph form now in his hand. He had perceived of it that it was addressed to Sylvia Tejans, and began the word "agreed." He said swiftly, "Has that been sent, or is it only a draft?" Tejan said, "That fellow is the Honourable Stephen Fenwick Waterhouse. He's a chairman of the Funded Department Commission. He's the swine who made us fake that return in the office." That moment was the worst McMaster had ever known. A worse came. Tejan said, "I'm going to have a word with him. That's why I'm not dining at Mountby. It's a duty to the country." McMaster's mind simply stopped. He was in a space, all windows. There was a sunlight outside, and clouds, pink and white, woolly. Some ships, and 2 men, one dark and oily, the other rather blotchy and a blonde baldness. They were talking, but their words made no impression on McMaster. The dark, oily man said that he was not going to take Gertie to Budapest. Not half. He winked like a nightmare. Beyond were 2 men, and a preposterous face. It was all like a nightmare that the cabinet minister's features were distorted for McMaster. Like an enormous mask of pantomime, shiny, with an immense nose and elongated Chinese eyes. Yet not unpleasant. McMaster was a Whig by conviction, by nation, by temperament. He thought that public servants would abstain from political activity. Nevertheless, he couldn't be expected to think a Liberal cabinet minister ugly. On the contrary, Mr. Waterhouse appeared to have a frank, humorous, kindly expression. He listened deferentially to one of his secretaries, resting his hand on the young man's shoulder, smiling a little, rather sleepily. No doubt he was overworked. And then, letting himself go in a side-shaking laugh. Putting on flesh. What a pity. What a pity. McMaster was reading a string of incomprehensible words in Tegan's heavily scored writing. Not entertain. Flat not house. Child remain at sister. His eyes went backwards and forwards over the phrases. He could not connect the words without stops. The man with the oily hair said in a sickly voice that Gertie was hot stuff, but not the one for Budapest with all the Gitana girls you were telling me of. Why, he'd kept Gertie for 5 years now. More like the real thing. His friend's voice was like the result of indigestion. Tidens, Sandbach, and the general were stiff, like pokers. What a pity, McMaster thought. He ought to have been sitting. It would have been pleasant and right to be sitting with a pleasant minister. In the ordinary course he, McMaster, would have been. The best golfer in the place was usually set to play with distinguished visitors, and there was next to no one in the south of England who ordinarily could beat him. He had begun at 4, playing with a miniature clique, and found shilling ball over the municipal links. Going to the poor school every morning, and back to dinner, and back to school, and back to bed. Over the cold, rushy, sandy links beside the grey sea, both shoes full of sand. The found shilling ball had lasted him 3 years. McMaster exclaimed, "Good God!" He had just gathered from the telegram that Tidgens meant to go to Germany on Tuesday. As if at McMaster's ejaculation, Tidgens said, "Yes, it is unbearable. If you don't stop those swine, General, I shall." The General sibilated low between his teeth. Wait a minute. Perhaps that other fellow will." The man with the black oily hair said, "If Budapest the place for the girls you say it is, old pal, then Turkish bars and all will paint the old town red all night next month." He winked at Tidgens. His friend, with his head down, seemed to make internal rumblings, looking apprehensively beneath his blotched forehead at the General. "Not," the other continued argumentatively, "that I don't love my old woman. She's all right. And then there's Gertie. Odd stuff, but the real thing. But I say a man wants..." He ejaculated. "Oh!" The General, his hands in his pockets, very tall, thin, red-cheeked, his white hair combed forward in a fringe, sauntered towards the other table. It was not 2 yards, but it seemed a long saunter. He stood right over them. They looked up, open-eyed, like schoolboys in a balloon. He said, "I'm glad you're enjoying our links, gentlemen." The bald man said, We are, first class, a treat." "But," the General said, "it isn't wise to discuss one's domestic circumstances at a mess. You know, or in Golf House. People might hear." The gentleman with the oily hair half rose and exclaimed, "Ooh, there." The other man mumbled, "Shut up, Briggs." The General said, "I'm the president of the club, you know. It's my duty to see that the majority of the club and its members and visitors are pleased. I hope you don't mind." The General came back to his seat. He was trembling with vexation. "It makes one as beastly a bounder as themselves," he said. "But what the devil else was one to do? The 2 city men had ambled hastily into the dressing rooms. A dire silence fell. McMaster realized that, for these Tories at least, this was really the end of the world. The last of England. He returned, with panic in his heart, to Tegan's telegram. Tegan was going to Germany on Tuesday. He offered to throw over the department. These were unthinkable things. You couldn't imagine them. He began to read the telegram over and over again. A shadow fell upon the flimsy sheets. Honourable Mr. Waterhouse was between the head of the table and the windows. He said, "We're much obliged, General. It was impossible to hear ourselves speak for those obscene fellows smut. It's fellows like that make our friends these suffragettes. That warrants them," he added. "Hello, Sandbach. Enjoying your rest?" The General said, "I was hoping you'd take on a job of telling these fellows off." Mr. Sandbach, his bulldog jaw sticking out, the short black hair on his scalp appearing to rise, barked. "Hello, what a slop. Enjoying your plunder?" Mr. Waterhouse, tall, slouched, and untidy head, lifted the flaps of his coat. It was so ragged that it appeared as if straws stuck out of the elbows. "All the suffragettes have left of me," he said laughingly. "Isn't one of your fellows a genius called Tegens?" He was looking at McMaster. The General said, "Tegens, McMaster." The Minister went on very friendly. "Oh, it's you! I just want to make the opportunity of thanking you." Tegan said, "Good God, what for?" "You know," the Minister said. "We couldn't have got the bill for the House till next session without your figures." He said slyly, "Could we, Sandbach?" and added to Tegens, "Ingleby told me." Tegens was chalk white and stiffened. He stuttered. I can't take any credit. I consider..." McMaster exclaimed, "Tegens, you..." He didn't know what he was going to say. "No, you're too modest." Mr. Waterhouse overwhelmed Tegens. "We know whom we've to think, and to thank." His eyes drifted to Sandbach a little absently. His face lit up. "Oh, look here, Sandbach," he said. "Come here, will you?" He walked a pace or two away, calling to one of his young men. "Oh, Sanderson, give the bobby a drink. A good stiff one." Sandbach jerked himself awkwardly out of his chair and limped to the Minister. Tegens burst out. "Me too modest? Me? Swine, the unspeakable swine." The General said, "What's it all about, Chrissy? You probably are too modest." Tegan said, "Damn it, it's a serious matter. It's driving me out of the unspeakable office I'm in." McMaster said, No, you're wrong. It's a wrong view you take." And with a good deal of real passion, he began to explain to the General. It was an affair that had already given him a great deal of pain. The government had asked the statistical department for figures illuminating a number of schedules that they desired to use in presenting their new bill to the Commons. Mr. Waterhouse was to present it. Mr. Waterhouse, at the moment, was slapping Mr. Sandbach on the back, tossing the hair out of his eyes and laughing like a hysterical schoolgirl. He looked suddenly tired. The police constable, his buttons shining, appeared drinking from a pewter pot outside the glazed door. The two city men ran across the angle from the dressing room to the same door, buttoning their clothes. The Minister said loudly, "Make it guineas!" It seemed to McMaster painfully wrong that Tegens should call anyone so genial and unaffected as an unspeakable swine. It was just unjust. He went on with his explanation to the general. The government had wanted to set a figures based on a calculation called B7. Tegens, who had been working on one called H19 for his own instruction, had persuaded himself that H19 was the lowest figure that was actuarially sound. The general said pleasantly, "All this is Greek to me." "Oh no, it needn't be," McMaster heard himself say. "It amounts to this. Chrissy was asked by the government, by Sir Reginald Ingleby, to work out what 3 by 3 comes to. It was that sort of thing in principle. He said that the only figure that would not ruin the country was 9 times 9. The government wanted to shovel money into the working man's pockets, in fact, the general said. Money for nothing. Or votes, I suppose. But that isn't the point, sir, McMaster ventured to say. All that Chrissy was asked to do was to say that what 3 by 3 was. Well, he appears to have done it all and earned no end of kudos, the general said. That's all right. We've all always believed in Chrissy's ability. But he's a strong-tempered beggar. He was extraordinarily rude to Sir Reginald over it, McMaster went on. The general said, "Oh dear, oh dear." He shook his head at Tegens and assumed with care the blank, slightly disapproving air of the regular officer. "I don't like to hear of rudeness to a superior, in any service." "I don't think," Tegens said with extreme mildness, "that McMaster is quite fair to me. Of course he's right in his opinion as to what the discipline of a service demands. I certainly told Ingleby that I'd rather resign than do that beastly job." "You shouldn't have," the general said. "What would become of the services if everyone did as you did?" Sandbach came back laughing and dropped painfully into his low armchair. "Fellow," he began. The general slightly raised his head. "A minute," he said. "I was about to tell Chrissy here that if I am offered the job, of course it is an order really, of suppressing the Ulster Volunteers, I'd rather cut my throat than do it." Sandbach said, "Course you would, old chap. Our brothers, you see the beastly lying government down first." "I was going to say that I should accept," the general said. "I shouldn't resign my commission." Sandbach said, "Good God." Tegens said, "Well, I didn't." Sandbach exclaimed, "General, you! After all Claudine and I have said." Tegens interrupted. "Excuse me, Sandbach, I'm receiving this reprimand for the moment. I wasn't, then, rude to Ingleby. If I'd expressed contempt for what he said, or for himself, that would have been rude. I didn't. He wasn't in the least offended. He looked like a cockatoo, but he wasn't offended. And I let him over-persuade me. He was right, really. He pointed out that if I didn't do the job, those swine would put on one of our little competition Wallerhead clerks and get all the schedules faked, as well as starting up with false premises." "That's the view I take," the general said. "If I don't take the Ulster job in the government, we'll put on a fellow who'll burn all the farmhouses and rape all the women in the 3 countries. They got him up their sleeve. He only asked for the Connaught Rangers to go through the north with. And you know what that means. All the same," he looked at Tegens, "one should not be rude to one's superiors." "I tell you I wasn't rude," Tegens exclaimed. "Damn your nice paternal old eyes. Get that into your mind." The general shook his head. "You brilliant fellows," he said. "The country, or the army, or anything, cannot be run by you. It takes stupid fools like me and Sandbach, along with sound, moderate heads like our friend here," indicated McMaster, and, rising, went on. "Come along. You're playing me, McMaster. They say you're hot stuff. Chrissy's no good. He can take Sandbach on. He walked off with McMaster towards the dressing room. Sandbach, wriggling awkwardly out of his chair, shouted, "Save the country, damn it!" He stood on his feet. "Aye, and Campion! Look at what the country's come to! What with smiling with those two in our clubhouses, and policemen go around like the lynx with ministers to protect them from the wild women, by God, I'd have to have the flaying of the skin off of some of their backs. I would. By God, I would." He added, "That fellow Waterslop's a bit of a sportsman. I haven't been able to tell you about our bet. You've been making much noise. Is your friend really +1 at North Berwick? What were you like?" "McMaster is a good +2 anywhere when he's in good practice." Sandbach said, "Good Lord, a stout fellow." "As for me," Tejan said, "I loathe the beastly game." "So do I," Sandbach answered. "We'll just lollop along behind them." And I will conclude here for now. If I can. If it'll let me. Well. The lag is really rather unpleasant. I need to get this all sorted out. There's so much lag. It's not even funny.